Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallay. Thanks for being with us. So we're going to talk today about ranked choice voting, which is something we've had as a topic on this show a number of times over the last couple of years. And this year is a really exciting cycle because there are a lot of ballot measures about ranked choice voting. So who best to have back on the show but our former host, Victoria Rose, so we can talk all about the various states with ballot measures. So Victoria, welcome back.
Thank you. I almost said thanks for being on the show, Jeff, but reverse of roles here.
Yeah, you're used to that cadence. I know.
Yes.
I just saw you. I just saw you a few weeks ago. Now you're back again. So It's great. It's good to see you. So yeah, ranked choice voting. We had a really fun 4-part series last year. So if listeners want to go back and dig into the December 2023 archives, you can listen to our series on what is ranked choice voting and what are the arguments in favor of and against it, and what do we think was going to happen in 2024. Well, now we're in October and it's been a really busy year. So tell us a little bit about what we're going to see on the ballot.
Yeah, sure. I think to start, just for our listeners who didn't get to listen to that series, highly recommend going back and listening to it. But a little refresher on what ranked choice voting is. It's an electoral system in which voters rank candidates by preference on their ballots. And there are multiple forms of ranked choice voting, but typically the process involves rounds of tallying voters' preference, with the person receiving the fewest first preference votes being eliminated, and then the second preference choices on those ballots are then counted as first preference until the person with the most first preference votes who wins a simple majority wins the race. So that's just a brief definition of ranked choice voting. There are different forms, and we do see a couple different forms on this year's ballot in a few different states. I'm looking forward to discussing which states are going to be deciding on it.
Yeah, so now there are some jurisdictions that do already use it. So what are some, if a listener wanted to go see how this looks in a state that already uses it or a city, what are some of the states and cities that do use it already?
The states that use it are Alaska and Maine, and then Hawaii uses it in some certain elections. And then there are 14 states with local jurisdictions that have authorized the use of ranked choice voting. And that's numerous local jurisdictions that use ranked choice voting.
It's the kind of thing where, your definition made sense to me, but if you're not too familiar with ranked choice voting, probably the easiest thing to do is go on to Ballotpedia, read our article about it, and then you look at some example vote boxes of how in Oakland or Minneapolis or New York City or in Alaska, how ranked choice voting has actually played out in elections. So it's been certainly a growing issue. So let's get right into that part of it. Who likes RCV? Who doesn't like RCV?
Yeah, well, I can speak to who at least is supporting and opposing these ballot measure campaigns to enact RCV. So on the support side, we've seen the biggest financial contributors to the cause of enacting RCV at the state level, including organizations like the Action Now Initiative, Unite America, and Fair Vote, and then individuals like Catherine Gale, who founded the Institute for Political Innovation, and Catherine Murdoch, who is a co-founder and president of the Quadrivium Foundation. The opponents of RCV include Majority Forward and Stop RCV, which is chaired by Trent England and Jason Sneed. We had Trent England on our RCV podcast special last year. And then most opponents for RCV are not as national as state. We've seen the Democratic and Republican parties of certain respective states oppose initiatives. That's the case this year in Colorado, but it really depends on the state's parties. Most of the opponents are very state specific for these ballot measures.
Yeah, so we'll get into that as we get into the various states, but it has been interesting to see that, in some states, it plays out kind of cleanly along a blue-red split, but in some cases, it doesn't play out as cleanly. So that's been pretty interesting to see as the issue has unfolded. So let's get into it. This year's ballot measure landscape. So I think we have 6 ballot measures this year on ranked choice voting. Is that right?
That's correct. And that is a record for any year. 6 is the most we've had ever. And those states include Alaska, Colorado, Idaho, Missouri, Nevada, and Oregon. There are also 2 ballot initiatives, one in Arizona and one in Montana, that could lead to the adoption of RCV in these states, but it depends on how the state legislature decides to implement those proposals.
Yeah, so it's either 6 or 8, depending on whether you include Arizona and Montana. And how many of those are what you would call in support of ranked choice voting? And how many would you call are in opposition?
Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon would all adopt ranked choice voting. Alaska would repeal ranked choice voting, which they adopted in 2020. And then Missouri would preempt ranked choice voting in the state.
And Alaska, in some respects, Feels, at least objectively, like it was kind of the start of the increasing spread of ranked choice voting ballot measures. So what's the track record? What has been the success rate, and what have voters kind of typically said at the polls on ballot measures for ranked choice voting over the years?
From 1965 through 2023, there were 6 statewide ballot measures. So it's definitely a newer phenomenon in the ballot measure world. Voters approved 4 and rejected 2. It was approved in Nevada in 2022. Obviously going to be on the ballot again in 2024 because it needs to be approved twice to be enacted. It was adopted, like I said, in Alaska in 2020 and in Maine in 2016. It's only been defeated as a ballot initiative to enact it in Massachusetts in 2020 in the last couple election cycles.
Going back all the way to 1965, does that mean there was actually a ranked choice voting ballot measure in the 1960s? Because I can't imagine there was very much activity in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. So
definitely at the local level.
Right. Yeah. You could almost say, let's go back to 1776, where choice voting has been on the ballot 6 times. Do we know of a first one that happened like in 1965 or something like that?
I think we use 1965 because that is the first local one in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Very interesting. So that's kind of when that's the first. And did it pass in Cambridge that cycle?
It was actually a vote to repeal proportional representation, and it was defeated.
Yeah, so for listeners, one of the interesting parts of ranked choice voting has been it's kind of had different names over the years. There was a time period where it was referred to as instant runoff voting, or as Victoria just said, proportional representation. Depends on the various stakeholders' choice of terminology. Generally speaking, national now, and this is the term we've been using here, ranked choice voting, RCV, is kind of the generally accepted term at this point in time. So what are some of the arguments that are made for and against ranked choice voting? Let's start with the arguments on the support side. We know from the way ballot measure campaigns are structured, especially this is something for listeners who are not in one of the 26 initiative referendum states, one thing you might not realize is there are really clear support and opposition sides to ballot measures. It's kind of one of the really cool parts of covering them. They make it really easy for us to not always that easy, I guess.
I was about to say
word, but it sometimes feels easier than candidate stances. But there are very explicit, let's call it that, explicit support and opposition sides. So that can really facilitate our ability to pull out what are the arguments. So that's often where we're talking specifically then right now about the support and opposition arguments that we see with these ballot measures. So when you're covering all these, Victoria, what are you seeing out there? Let's start with the support side.
Yeah, most supporters of RCV argue that the system provides an alternative to our current two-party system, allows more support for minor and third-party candidates. They also argue it increases stability, getting rid of that two-party system. It leads to more diverse candidates and saves money for state and local governments when it's used as an instant runoff system. On the other side, opponents of RCV argue that the system benefits voters with more time and information because it obviously requires more research to look into each of these candidates that you're being presented with. It leads to decreased voter confidence in elections because of a longer wait for election results due to the rounds of counting. And then they also argue that it disconnects voting from important policy issues and debates because the parties are no longer involved in the nominating process in the same way as they are in a plurality election or partisan primary system. And then RCV winners do not necessarily represent the will of the voters is another big argument we see.
Listeners, if they want to read a whole lot more about the various arguments, you can read those on Ballotpedia, or you can listen to the episodes from last year where we specifically talked to supporters and opponents of ranked choice voting. You can find those in the show notes if you want to go find them there after this episode. So let's talk a little more then, Victoria, about the 6 RC measures again this year. So Alaska, Colorado, Idaho, Missouri, Nevada, Oregon. And just got to do a little lightning around context for each one. And let's start out with Oregon 117. So if approved, this would implement ranked choice voting in primaries in general for federal and state executive offices in 2028. But it would not do state legislatures, if I'm reading that right. And tell us a little bit about how did that get on the ballot and what does it look like?
Yeah, so this Oregon Measure 117 is the first ranked choice voting ballot measure that would enact ranked choice voting that was referred to the ballot by state legislature. So all of the other ballot measures that enacted ranked choice voting were citizen initiated. And like you said, this one is notable because it does exclude state legislative elections from its ranked choice voting provisions, but includes federal elections and all other state elective offices.
Yeah, this is what's so interesting, right? Is so Oregon's a Democratic trifecta. So this is put on the ballot by Democratic Party legislators in Oregon. In Maine and in Alaska, where ranked choice voting was implemented through citizen initiative, it includes both federal and state legislative elections. And so what we're seeing in Oregon is that the state legislature implementing the system specifically left their own elections off of the definition, so to speak. So how has that played out in the campaign so far?
It's definitely been an argument the opponents have used, like, why would you put this on the ballot but exclude yourselves from it? The governor has come out against the measure, Governor Tina Kotek.
Also a Democrat.
Also a Democrat.
This speaks again to it's not a clear-cut
red and blue
party line situation.
Correct. Yeah, I can't speak to the odds of it passing. There aren't a lot of ballot measure polls for this measure out there. But RCV has been adopted in several local jurisdictions in Oregon, including Benton County, Corvallis, Multnomah County, and Portland. It's not in use in Multnomah County and Portland quite yet, but it will be. Well, in Portland, it's scheduled for use this year.
What's the polling been like in Oregon for this measure? Is there any polling out there?
No.
Yeah, we see that sometimes with a lot of ballot measures. So let's move to Alaska then. So Alaska, which has already had statewide RCV approved in 2020, now there's a reverse situation to potentially withdraw and repeal RCV. So tell us a little bit about how that campaign is looking and what led to this being put on the ballot.
Yeah, so this is Alaska ballot question 2. It was filed in late November 2022. It's a citizen initiative measure that was qualified for the ballot. And like you said, it's going to potentially repeal RCV in Alaska. The top donor to the campaign is called Ranked Choice Education Association. In the campaign's words, they quote, this is their argument against getting rid of it. In 2020, a Colorado-based political action committee, Unite America, spent more than $1 million to upend Alaska's election system and impose a confusing ranked voting process that suppressed voter turnout in 2022 and threw out thousands of voters' ballots through ballot exhaustion, end quote. So that's their argument against getting rid of it. Opponents of ballot question 2 want to keep RCV in place. They include Action Now Initiative, the 1630 Fund, and Unite America. So some of those supporters of RCV that I mentioned earlier who work on a national scale for these measures. And they argue the system has offered Alaskans more choice, more influence, and actually greater participation among voters.
Yeah, and this is a good example where it's super interesting to see how ranked choice voting is playing out, because what you do have is a number of different national groups, either in support or opposition of the issue. And the national groups end up playing in these states when these statewide ballot measures go before voters. So you see them sort of playing out this back and forth through the sort of outcome, I guess, of a statewide ballot measure. So that's going to be a pretty interesting one. How about Alaska? Any polling up there?
No polling, not like a consensus of polling. There might be one off. There's none listed on our page currently, so there's usually not the money to fund those polls, even for big issues like this.
So let's move to Nevada then, now, Victoria, and let's talk a little bit about this ranked choice voting measure that is on the ballot for the second time, which you kind of alluded to earlier. That's because of the really unique process in Nevada. So let's go through that process again, and why, and how did the votes look in the last cycle, and what is it looking like in this cycle?
Like I mentioned before, it was approved in 2022 with 52.9% of the vote. It needs to be approved again because it's an initiated constitutional amendment, and in Nevada, those need to be approved at 2 consecutive elections. So it will be on the ballot again. This is a general election. This is Nevada question 3. It would adopt open top 5 primaries and then use ranked choice voting for general elections. And this would apply to congressional, gubernatorial, state executive official, and state legislative elections in the state.
And so you kind of alluded to one of the interesting differences between these measures is sometimes there's a top 5 system, sometimes there's a top 4 system. Sometimes the ranked choice voting system doesn't make any commentary about how the primary should play out. So what we're seeing is different strategies and different approaches as to how these different groups they want to present the political system for voters. So how is that difference and distinction playing out as you cover it?
So like Nevada's top 5, but we are going to see top 4 RCV in Idaho and Colorado this November. And like you mentioned, a top primary system is where candidates, they run in a single primary election regardless of the candidate's party affiliation. It also varies by state whether or not a party affiliation is listed with the candidate's name on the ballot. I know that's the case in Idaho and Colorado. Candidates can list their party affiliation. It's not like they're nominated by the party, but it's a signifier to voters that that's obviously their party affiliation. and then X number of candidates, whether that's 4 in Idaho and Colorado or 5 in Nevada, advance to the general election where ranked choice voting would be used. So that's the primary difference, is just that number of candidates advancing from the primary to the general election. In that instant runoff ranked choice voting, I think there's really no primary. You would all be listed, and then the last candidate standing would be the winner.
Okay, let's move to the last one, Missouri then. So Missouri Amendment 7.
Yeah, also a unique one out of the bunch. Missouri Amendment 7 was put on the ballot by the state legislature. It has 2 provisions. One would require citizenship to vote, which is another trend we're seeing in the ballot measure world this election cycle. And then the second provision would prohibit ranked choice voting in the state and at the local level as well. It's doing this by stating in the state constitution that every voter is entitled to 1 vote per seat or per issue. There's one notable exception to this amendment, though, that they're including, and that is that it would not apply to any nonpartisan municipal elections that are in effect as of November 5th, so the election day. And this would apply to specifically St. Louis, where they adopted approval voting in 2020. And approval voting is different than RCV, just another electoral system where voters can vote for any number of candidates that they quote unquote approve of. And so that would stay in place despite this.
That is certainly going to be a very interesting one down in Missouri. Is there any polling in Missouri telling us what it looks like is going to happen out there? You're shaking your head.
I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
Well, it's okay. I mean, there's a lot of ballot measure activity around ranked choice voting this cycle. Part of the reason for that is, really states across the country have been taking up this issue for a few years now. We saw no slowdown with respect to legislative activity this year as well. So this is a little bit outside of your coverage space, but let's just briefly talk about the legislation that passed in states this year and what kind of activity we saw with respect to states themselves.
Sure. So like you said, states stepping into this issue is very recent. So in 2022, Florida and Tennessee became the first 2 states to prohibit ranked choice voting in their states. But as of October 2024, there are 10 that have prohibited ranked choice voting, including Alabama, Idaho, which is going to have ranked choice voting on the ballot, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Oklahoma, South Dakota. They have all enacted bans on ranked choice voting. There were 5 enacted of those states this year, which is more than any year that we've seen. So it's definitely picking up steam in these Republican-led legislatures. And then in addition to these bans, we also just track electoral system legislation, and our listeners can check out more specifics about those specific legislation in their state, or they could check out the highlights of our RCV related legislation in our mid-year report, which we published back in July.
Yeah, you can listen to our prior episodes on legislation tracking or come to Ballotpedia's elections legislation tracker. But ranked choice voting has certainly been a pretty busy legislative topic over the last few years now. I'm sure we'll see more of that in 2012 as well. Well, Victoria, it's going to be a really busy election season. It was great having you back on today. Always good to see you. And good luck with the next phase that's coming up. So
thank you for having me, Jeff.
Yeah. Bye, Victoria. And for our listeners, you can learn more about ranked choice voting and our ballot measures coverage at the links in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Halley, and thanks for listening.